We seek out the deep wilderness to find absolute isolation. Every year, millions of campers drive miles away from civilization, hike past the tree line, and deliberately sever their ties to the rest of humanity. But when we finally arrive in that dark expanse, we rely on a single, fragile mechanism for safety. A millimeter-thick sliver of nylon becomes the only physical barrier separating a brightly lit interior from the pitch-black exterior. We zip the door shut, and our brains process the enclosed space as a fortress, despite offering zero structural resistance to outside force. The reality is much darker. Tonight, we are examining 4 true incidents where the illusion of the seemingly empty wilderness was violently shattered by the arrival of uninvited human predators. The environment itself is rarely the true threat. The deepest terror comes from the devastating realization that your campsite is completely exposed and your paper fortress is entirely vulnerable to whatever is waiting in the dark. A psychological breach often begins at the perimeter. It is the chilling moment a camper realizes they are not alone, that the remote location is being actively observed from the tree line. A young couple thought they had found total privacy setting up camp in a wilderness gorge. It is an area defined by steep, trapping rock walls and dark, isolated tunnel access. Their isolation was broken by a transient man who claimed he had been living in those woods for nearly a month. He was aggressive, his stories were entirely inconsistent, and worst of all, he had purposefully set up his own camp on an elevated ridge. This gave him a direct, straight-shot view right down into the couple's vulnerable position. This exact dynamic of isolation favoring a predator played out at a Boy Scout campout. The Scoutmasters enforced a rule to pitch tents far apart, unintentionally creating massive, dark hunting grounds between the vulnerable campers. One 15-year-old scout, forced to sleep alone, woke to the sound of heavy boots circling his tent. When he unzipped the door, he found a massive man standing in the moonlight, smiling silently and raising a single finger to his lips. Both victims eventually realized that the lone threat they were facing was likely a fabrication. In the gorge, the woman discovered a campsite equipped for an entire group of men, despite the stranger's claims of being alone. For the scout, the heavy, circling footsteps suggested a presence far more substantial than the single stranger who finally stepped into the light, leaving the terrifying implication that others were still hiding just out of sight. A perimeter breach destroys the assumption that distance equals safety. When you are hours away from help, isolation actually works in the predator's favor. The terror escalates drastically when a threat moves past the tree line and closes the distance to the fabric itself. During a late-night camping trip along the Willamette River, a group of friends settling into their tents heard a strange noise from the deep woods. It was the distinct, mocking laugh of an adult male, slowly moving closer to their sight. The campers were struck by a terrifying anomaly. The man's laughter was now right at the edge of their campsite, yet the woods were dead silent. There was absolutely no auditory tracking data of footsteps, a physical impossibility in dense brush. The laughter stopped entirely. They sat frozen in the silence until broken by something rubbing against the outside of their tent, followed instantly by the outline of a human hand pressing hard into the fabric. Physical contact with the tent represents the complete, undeniable collapse of the camper's protective boundary. In a fraction of a second, the brain stops treating the nylon as a wall and instantly triggers sheer panic. The final and most invasive stage of the breakdown bypasses the exterior entirely, an undetected infiltration of the camper's interior space. A solo backpacker spent a week deep in the Canadian wilderness. He was days away from the nearest town, navigating dense, endless evergreen forests, completely severed from civilization. He brought several disposable cameras with him to document the long trip. Weeks later, when he had the film developed at home, he found 2 photographs right in the middle of the roll. They were pictures taken from inside his own tent, showing him fast asleep and completely defenseless. An internal infiltration is the ultimate psychological violation. It proves that even our deepest layers of perceived security in the wild are entirely fictional. Every victim in these encounters physically survived the night, escaping their campsites and returning to civilization. But the psychological damage they sustained did not end at the tree line. The Canadian backpacker permanently abandoned camping. To this day, he sleeps with his bedroom door completely open and his curtains tightly shut. He adopted these specific, paranoid coping mechanisms because the boundary of safety cannot be rebuilt. These 4 encounters reveal a sobering truth about human nature and the outdoors. We venture into the trees believing we are leaving danger behind, relying on a dangerous self-deception about the emptiness of the wild. Once you understand the true fragility of that boundary, the illusion is broken permanently. Closing a tent zipper will never feel secure.